Hello, and welcome to students, parents, families, and our esteemed panelists who have traveled a long way to be here with us today. It is such a privilege to see you all here, early in the morning by most college student standards, and introduce what we think is a critical conversation that is necessary both on Brown's campus and across the country. We are Ben and Mintaka, the editors-in-chief of BPR, and we'd like to speak just for a moment about our organization and what we hope to do here today. The Brown Political Review is a nonpartisan political magazine that seeks to produce in-depth analysis of national and global issues and spark a conversation between different political parties and organizations on Brown's campus and beyond to promote rational, respectful discourse between differing political perspectives. BPR aims to create not only a space for outstanding student journalism and political expression. Our alumni and staff have gone on to intern and work at Huffington Post and the White House, among others, but to transcend the partisanship and refusal to engage that characterizes much of media and politics in the 21st century. This event is somewhat of a celebration of our second anniversary. Starting with a staff of 40 in the fall of 2012, we now have over 120 undergraduates and graduate students who contribute to both the magazine, which we publish twice a semester, and our website, which puts up new articles, interviews, and multimedia projects every day. We are entirely student-run, and with generous support from the Political Theory Project, have been able to accomplish a lot in the past 2 years. However, there's a lot more we could still do, and we'd like to ask for your support as well. Our staff will be in the lobby during and after the show to answer any questions, and our business team is available to talk to you about purchasing subscriptions to the magazine, advertising, or donating to our cause and operations. Please feel free to take a magazine as well on your way out. And if you are a student here, don't forget to submit an article idea on our website by tomorrow at midnight to be considered for a spot in our next magazine. BPR is nonpartisan because we believe that conversation across party lines, as in genuine engagement with the intention of producing a better future, not just marking points on political scorecards, is essential to a healthy democracy. Our staff is dedicated to creating a space for that conversation on campus and beyond, and we hope to widen that space through a conversation this morning. Today, we have brought together 5 panelists from a range of backgrounds, publications, and political perspectives to discuss partisanship and polarization in modern media. With years of experience under their belts, they probably have far more interesting things to say than we do. So without further ado, we'd like to introduce our moderator for this event, Professor Tracy Breton, who Mintaka will now introduce. Thank you.
Professor Breton is a magna cum laude graduate of Syracuse University, where she earned simultaneous degrees in journalism from the Newhouse School of Public Communications and in political science from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. In 1973, she joined the Providence Journal and quickly cultivated a role as a nationwide leader in investigative reporting, focusing on legal matters and the courts. For a series of stories that exposed corruption in the Rhode Island court system and led to the resignation and conviction of the state's Chief Justice and his top administrator, Professor Breton shared the Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Reporting in 1994. The following year, she was awarded the Master Reporter Award by the New England Society of Newspaper Editors. In 2006, Breton was one of the 10 journalists selected for a Rosalind Carter Fellowship for Mental Health Journalism to write about elder abuse and exploitation in the cognitively impaired. Since 1997, Breton has taught as a visiting professor of journalism at Brown in the English department's nonfiction writing program. She retired from the Providence Journal last October after 40 years at the newspaper. She continues to teach and is currently working on a nonfiction book. Please join us in welcoming both Professor Breton and our incredible panel today.
Thank you, Ben and Mintaka, for your nice remarks, and to you and all the wonderful students working with you for the Brown Political Review who put together this event. Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for coming to what I anticipate will be a very informative and thought-provoking panel. The format of the panel will have me posing questions to each of our guests here for a little over an hour, and after that, the floor will open to members of our audience who will be allowed to ask their own questions. I ask that when that part of the event begins, that those with questions please line up at the microphones that are set up in the aisles so that everyone can hear you. We'll be taking your questions for about 45 minutes. Now I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. David Korn is the Washington Bureau Chief for Mother Jones, an award-winning, liberal-leaning magazine featuring investigative and breaking news reporting on politics, the environment, human rights, and culture. He previously worked for 20 years as the Washington editor of The Nation magazine. Mr. Korn has blogged for the Huffington Post, CQ Politics, and The Guardian, and published a regular column at The Nation. He's also written for The Washington Post, The New York Times, The Los Angeles Times, The Washington Times, The Philadelphia Inquirer, The Boston Globe, Mother Jones, and numerous other publications. Very prolific. He is the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, Hubris, The Inside Story of Spin, Scandal, and the Selling of the Iraq War, and also authored another bestseller, The Lies of George W. Bush, Mastering the Politics of Deception. Mr. Korn has long been a prominent commentator on television and radio, regularly appearing on Hardball, The Rachel Maddow Show, and other MSNBC shows. He's also appeared on The O'Reilly Factor, Hannity and Combs, and On the Record with Greta Van Susteren. He was a regular panelist on the syndicated PBS show Eye on Washington, and in 2012 he won the George Polk Award for political reporting for his 47% story on Mitt Romney's 2012 election campaign. He's also written several crime thriller novels and graduated from Brown in 1981. Where he concentrated in history and wrote for the BDH and Fresh Fruit, an alternative weekly distributed throughout Rhode Island, and at the time was the second largest publication in the state, second to my own Providence Journal. Kevin Merida is a managing editor of the Washington Post. Earlier this year, the Post won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for work produced during Merida's first year overseeing news and features coverage. Previously, Mr. Merida worked as a writer and editor at the Dallas Morning News and the Milwaukee Journal, where he specialized in writing about crime and society. He started working at the Washington Post in 1993, covering primarily U.S. politics, including news related to the White House and Congress. He edited an anthology about African-American men in the United States called Being a Black Man at the Corner of Progress and Peril in 2007, and also co-authored Obama, the Historic Campaign and Photographs in 2008 with Deborah Willis, and Supreme Discomfort, The Divided Soul of Clarence Thomas with Michael A. Fletcher. Mr. Merida's journalistic focus has also included profiles of Strom Thurmond, Bob Dole, George W. Bush, and Newt Gingrich. He was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 1990 and was selected Journalist of the Year by the National Association of Black Journalists in 2000 and won the Vernon Jarrett Award for Journalistic Excellence in 2006. In 1979, he graduated from Boston University. Richard Toffel is the founding general manager of ProPublica, an independent Pulitzer Prize-winning nonprofit newsroom that produces investigative journalism in the public interest. He served in that position from 2007 through 2012. In January 2013, he became ProPublica's president. Mr. Toffel has responsibility for all of ProPublica's non-journalism operations. He was formerly the assistant publisher of the Wall Street Journal, and earlier an assistant managing editor of the paper and an assistant general counsel of Dow Jones. He also previously served as vice president, general counsel, and secretary of the Rockefeller Foundation, and earlier as president and chief operating officer of the International Freedom Center, a museum and cultural center that was planned for the World Trade Center site. He's the author of 6 books: Why American Newspapers Gave Away the Future, 8 Weeks in Washington, 1861, Abraham Lincoln and the Hazards of Transition, Restless Genius, Barney Kilgore, The Wall Street Journal, and the Invention of Modern Journalism, Sounding the Trumpet, The Making of John F. Kennedy's Inaugural Address, Vanishing Point, The Disappearance of Judge Crater and the New York He Left Behind, and A Legend in the Making, The New York Yankees, in 1939. He obtained a BA law degree and MA in public policy from Harvard. Please welcome him. Erica Greeter is an alumnus of Columbia University and the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. She is currently a senior editor at Texas Monthly. From 2007 to 2012, she covered Texas as the Southwest correspondent for The Economist, to which she still contributes. Her work has also appeared in The New York Times, The Spectator, The Atlantic Foreign Policy, and The New Republic. Her first book, Big, Hot, Cheap, and Right: What America Can Learn from the Strange Genius of Texas, was published in April 2013 by Public Affairs Books. Please welcome her. Catherine Mangue-Ward writes for the libertarian magazine Reason, the magazine of free minds and free markets, where she is also the managing editor. Her writing frequently focuses on food, technology, and education policy. Ms. Mangue-Ward also currently serves as a 2013-2014 Future Tense Fellow at the New America Foundation, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy institute and think tank. She started her journalism career as a reporter for the Weekly Standard and was also a researcher for the New York Times op-ed page. Her work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the New York Times Online, and numerous other publications. She is a frequent commentator for National Public Radio, CNBC, C-SPAN, Fox Business, Fox News Channel, and MSNBC. She graduated from Yale with a BA in political science and philosophy. Please welcome her. Okay, we're going to get to our questions now. Some journalists and pundits have argued that partisan news sources encourage democratic participation. Do you think that openly partisan journalism leads to a more active readership? And does partisan media offer a way to make citizens more engaged in politics? David, do you want to start this?
Sure. Let me just say I'm really happy to be here. Last time I was in this room, I was on the other side and listening to Lyman Kirkpatrick, who had been an IG at the CIA, who was here at Brown for many years, teaching a course in the history of intelligence. So it's very thrilling to me to be where I used to watch Professor Kirkpatrick. It really depends what you mean when you say partisan media. The history of journalism in this country is often, the media has been partisan more often than not. When you had newspapers in New York City and elsewhere that were run by tycoons, newspaper tycoons, the Citizen Kane types, William Randolph Hearst and others, who were very partisan. And the papers were identified as being aligned with this party or that party. And it's only been in the past 100 years or so when there's been a move from that amongst the mainstream media towards getting rid of partisan identities for journalistic entities. But I don't think of whether it's Reason or the Weekly Standard or the Nation magazine or Mother Jones as being partisan. I think we have, to different degrees, ideological foundations to what we do. And in some instances, it can be a journalism that is more opinion-driven, such as ranting and raving and complaining about things, or it can be a journalism that is driven by reporting, which is what I think we do at Mother Jones. Our ideological perspective really affects how we, what we focus on, not so much how we do it. And in that case, I think having entities out there that are, upfront, transparent about where they're coming from is a good thing. It does lead to a certain development of identity between audience and the product that's being produced, which is usually good. But I do think that overall, and we can talk about this, I'm sure, for hours on end, that the increase in politicization overall in this country and how that's had an impact on the media and how the media has played a role in that has both good and bad results. There's no Walter Cronkite anymore who can go to Vietnam and come back and say, the government's really not telling us the truth, and change the debate, or Ed Murrow changed the debate of McCarthyism. That doesn't exist anymore because everything is so nichified and often in partisan ways. So, but overall, I think it's settling on the terms of the debate is really important here, and that to me the issue is not whether media is impartial enough or not, as the title of the panel puts it. It to me is whether you're being accurate, and that still is the thing that whether it's a Kevin Shop or ProPublica or a Reason, to me that's the bottom line. Are you putting forward accurate information? And if you are, even if you're doing it from an ideological or even a partisan perspective, then you're contributing to an informed debate.
Catherine, do you want to add in here a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I guess, I would say that there's often when we lament the partisanship of media, what we actually are lamenting is the ad hominem nature of that partisanship. And it's easy to say that that's a modern problem. I actually, while David was talking, pulled up my favorite quote ever, which is from the Adams-Jefferson election of 1800, in which Jefferson, in one of his kind of media mouthpiece papers, because at the time the papers were associated strongly with candidates, called Adams a blind, bald, crippled, toothless man who is a hideous hermaphroditic character with neither the force and fitness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. This is the election of 1800, right? So like whatever's happening in 2016, it's not that. And this was happening in explicitly partisan media. So I think, there's this sort of notion that, everything is bad now and there was once a golden age. As David mentioned, that's clearly not the case. At the same time, I think there is sort of the most useful form of this is when, National Review sits down and picks apart every line of some bill that the Obama administration, wants to see go through, just because they hate Obama, right? It doesn't have to be that they're like particularly brilliant policy analysts. They're going to find people who are good at picking something apart and publish that takedown in their pages. That's actually a good thing. That's useful. That's a useful thing when we are debating policy. So, I think when we freak out about partisan media, it's worth keeping in mind that there might be a right way and a wrong way to do it.
I would add, too, I think that this debate we've been having contemporaneously about polarization in media and partisanship in media has been concurrent with an amount of technological change, change in the media industry, decentralization, increasingly online publishing, 24-hour publishing, new media streams like Twitter, which now is like the fastest news feed you can get. I think that's amplified the visibility of partisanship, and it's created more access to information in some ways. So in the example of Cronkite, we don't have a Cronkite who goes to Vietnam now. We do have news feeds from Vietnam. We have people tweeting from Vietnam. We have reporters in Vietnam that we can all see in real time unfolding. I think that also creates more interaction with the journalists too, more discussion, more activity, more engagement among some readers at least, and the journalists who are producing the news, which again is open to the public. So I think that technological aspect of it has to be considered part of the situation.
Sure.
A couple of quick points. Historically, I think the distinction that people are I think trying to go toward, and certainly one that I would share, is that to go back to your question, ideological journalism, I think can actually be very helpful in the public debates, in groping toward a civic conversation. I think partisan journalism as distinguished from ideological journalism, was frankly bad for the country in 1800, and I think it's bad for the country on MSNBC and Fox, and I don't think it contributes to turnout, and I don't think it contributes to the health of our democracy. Just one other thing, because interestingly, I watched last year's seminar before I came here earlier this week, and it's come up now again, interestingly. This business about what we've lost is Walter Cronkite coming back from Vietnam and telling us that we've lost a war. So here's the interesting historical problem that I think we all need to grapple with. I think it is very clear in retrospect, I think scholarship, particularly Peter Braystrup's scholarship, has established very well that when Walter Cronkite said that, he was wrong. That in fact, when he said the United States military had lost the war in Vietnam, they were arguably, in retrospect, on the verge of winning it. And we didn't understand that, our military didn't understand it, and our politicians didn't understand it. And he helped them not understand it. And that is a very big problem. And when you have a consensus press that sets itself up as the arbiter of the truth in that way, one thing that is extraordinarily important is that it be right.
Exactly.
Well, everybody's making some really, really great points. I would just add that, the internet is wonderfully egalitarian. I mean, people can go out and search and find the sites, the places to get what they want and what fuels them, and if they have a particular interest, they can go to a site that's going to drum that interest. Some people like policy sites, some people like polling sites. They can find what they need. The destructive part about it is that a lot of distortion gets into the public debate, where themes become untrue, and then it's sometimes cited. Well, it was on the internet. It was out there. It was in the conversation, but it's not been vetted. It's not been, and that's the destructive part of places that are only in the ideological business. It doesn't mean that you don't get good reporting. I'll go back to what David said, whether you're coming from a liberal perspective or a conservative perspective. It's not that if the National Review, to use one example, doesn't do great reporting. They may have a particular push and focus, but doesn't mean necessarily that just because you're conservative or the liberal spectrum that you can't reveal things that are truthful. We're not in that business at the Washington Post. We're trying to basically look for stories wherever they lie. And, the part of the problem with the climate we're in is that I think that people are filtering the information and wondering, is someone coming from a liberal perspective or a conservative perspective? And if they want one of those, they're going to the places where they feel they can trust the information. And if they're conservative, and they go to the conservative places because they believe they can trust it there.
Well, that's sort of my next question. I mean, is this sort of explosion in partisan or ideological media leading to people, a citizenry that's only informed about and only eager to learn about ideas that they agree with?
Yes. I do come across people, not that many, who are, conservatives who tell me they look at Mother Jones just to see what, the other side has to say or whatever. There are people who make, conspicuous efforts to get out of their own bubble, but I think, it takes a lot more energy to do that. I mean, Kevin is right in that never in the time of human history has every individual had more access to information. I mean, it's quite, it's a revolution, as people have called it. But yet that, you get flooded by that information, and it's hard to figure out where to drink from the fire hose. And a lot of people do what they tend to do in other aspects of their life. They stay where they're comfortable. and they take their cues from people they may follow on Twitter or go to sites that they want, and therefore we end up in a lot of ways with different competing realities where, 20% of America thinks Benghazi is the most important story there is. I mean, I've had people tell me that, and 20% believe it's a complete fraud, and the other 60% are kind of either don't care about it or don't know what to think about it.
But it's even worse than that, I think,
Okay, you make it
unfortunately.
worse.
Because, there's this line of Senator Moynihan's, everyone is entitled to their own opinion and no one is entitled to their own facts.
Right.
And this kind of approach derides the facts. You're entitled to alternative views of whether Benghazi is a major scandal or not. You are not entitled to your own views about the transmissibility of Ebola, right? That is a scientific fact. You are not entitled to your own views about it. Sorry. And so, for instance, you end up with a situation in this world where the governor of New York gives a news conference on Thursday night, and then he doesn't like he doesn't like what he reads in the papers Friday morning, so he gives another news conference on Friday afternoon, which, if you lay them side by side, are literally irreconcilable, right? And everybody just sort of nods and, reports this with a straight face, instead of just saying, on Thursday, the governor told the truth. He didn't like the reaction to it, so on Friday he said a bunch of things that are just nonsense, right?
But the question is, why is the New York
When
Times...
the governor of New York stands up at a news conference and says things that are simply, factually, scientifically untrue, the job of the press should be to say, that is nonsense.
But why? The question is, and coming from the Wall Street Journal, and maybe Kevin gets in on this too, is why won't the Washington Post and the New York Times ever do a lead? Yesterday, what the governor said was nonsense. Yesterday, what the president said about weapons in Iraq was contradicted by his own intelligence estimates. You don't see that type of reporting because I often think people fear that they would look like it's ideological.
Well, no, I think it may not be in that language, but I do think where there are contradictions, they are pointed out. And there are lots of other, you forget, there are lots of ways that you come at it. There are analysis, there is commentary, there's investigative reporting that seeks to break it down, there's explanatory, there are lots of forms. And I think the public also smart. I mean, we are kind of decrying, I do. I mean, honestly, I think that, we're decrying, and I'm joined in on that, a lot of the distortion, but if you give people these perspectives, then they do break through. When we do fact checkers, we have a fact checker. That's another cottage industry that's grown up where and it really has impact. When people are called on Glenn Kessler, he gives Pinocchios out. If you get 4 Pinocchios, you've had a bad day,
And class of 81, Brown University, Glenn
Kessler, okay. Another Brown alum. I helped make him the fact checker, so I'm going to take some credit for that. And so there are lots of other forms that come at it. It may not be, David says, we say the governor lied yesterday in what he said, but I think you would see the contrast and you would have some accountability.
I think the problem, though, is, this isn't a media problem. This is like a human brains problem. People are just astonishingly, thoroughly terrible at discerning their own biases, right? This is something that it's true everywhere. Like, every mother thinks her baby is the most beautiful, and that goes all the way up through, every voter thinks their president is the most beautiful. And it's a mess, except that there's an antidote built into the poison, which is that we are brilliant at discerning biases in others. We are just really, really good at that. And there's a huge body of neuroscientific literature on this, but I actually think that fact is precisely what sort of makes the case for a lively, pluralistic, ideological or partisan media. I am so good at seeing all the places that David Corn is just full of beans.
Really?
And and vice versa. But then this month, they did a cover story on the militarization of police and how that's been increasing, and this is something that Reason Magazine agrees with Mother Jones on. And I read this issue and I was like, God, this is so brilliant. I don't see any problems in this story. And it seems unlikely that this month Mother Jones suddenly just like really nailed it, right? It's because I'm terrible at seeing my own biases, but it's lucky because we're really good at undermining each other. So that's, I think that's, there is a role for fact checkers. There is a role for sort of, this sort of good faith attempt to be accurate. But still, I think the problem isn't somehow that the media is a corrupt industry. It's just like our brains.
I like that sort of optimistic vision you're painting of a contest of ideas, but I think maybe we're all still practicing that or getting used to that. I see it happen, I think, just as often, if not more often, that when there's a sort of, a story comes out or kind of opinion is widely held among a certain set of publications, and then there's some pushback from the other side. Then instead of having a kind of discussion about it, there's that angry overreaction of like, no, not only am I not wrong about this, you're an idiot, and that kind of, fuels from there. I see it happen a lot. Most recently on this summer with the sort of influx of migrants from Central America, and there was sort of some people pointed out, I think when that started happening, that chronologically and sort of descriptively, you can see a connection between that and the president's executive order in 2012 saying we're not going to enforce migration law against certain minors. And the backlash to that was just severe, I think, among a lot of mainstream media. No, that's not, that was not a legal change. President Bush signed this thing in 2008. That was the issue, not Obama's thing. And what kind of started out as we're citing this factor among other causal factors became this very contentious debate, I think for no reason and really not to good effect.
I think one issue, though, is that, the media is working within, despite what happened in 1800, is working within a highly partisan and ideological culture. So, it's hard when you're talking about Richard and facts that, like, you take a poll now and 30% of Americans believe that Obama is Muslim. Okay, now, is that the media's fault? Has it anything to do with media reporting? Is it just people's predisposition to believe something they want to believe, even if the facts are against it? And it turns out that 60% or 50% of Republicans believe this, and a high percentage of Fox News viewers believe this. And so, in an environment like that, how does media operate, with the highest goal of informing the public accurately? I think it's very tough.
And that sort of leads into my next question.
Glad I could help.
So how culpable is the media to contributing to widespread political polarization, or does it merely reflect the political environment that we live in, or is it one of the architects of that environment?
Well, I don't think it's our fault. I
think that's the final word.
Thank you.
I think it depends. I mean, honestly, I think that it depends who we're including in media in that question. I think there are certainly some sort of ferocious partisans on both sides, ferocious outlets that really, I think, sort of push, different priorities, push a certain approach to those priorities, and they, I don't think, speak for the majority of Americans on either side, but they do have a certain influence among the communities that follow them closely, and you can see, you can see how those effects play out. But I think that the media in general is not the main thing I would point to as the source of polarization. I would point probably first to gerrymandering. That's created more incentive for both parties to kind of go to the ends of their spectrum in who they elect.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that the two largest and most powerful factors driving the polarization of the country politically are, one, gerrymandering, where I think you literally now have a system in the House of Representatives in most cases, and in many state legislatures around the country, where instead of the voters choosing their representatives, it has literally come to the point where the representatives are choosing their constituents. That is not what Madison had in mind, and it is a very, very serious problem with enormous consequence. I do think The second most powerful driver of this is our campaign finance system, where, and both of these, I will say, both of these lie at the feet of the Supreme Court. Where our campaign finance system, in which Justice Kennedy, who has worked in the same room in Washington now for about 30 years, and has never worked anywhere else in the last 30 years, came to believe that our political system discloses political contributions adequately, and that there is therefore no risk of corruption. That is simply factually not correct. Increasingly, it does not disclose the source of political funding. We did some reporting a couple of years ago in which we demonstrated that a majority of the money on both sides of the United States Senate campaign in New Mexico were completely untraceable by you, by me, or by any of us. Let me tell you the two people that we know for sure who knew who was giving that money. The two candidates. Okay? Don't kid yourselves. They know where their money is coming from. We just don't know where their money is coming from. There are lots of other factors. The media is one of them, but none of them, I think, compare to those two.
Kevin, I've got a question for you. How can journalists navigate their own bias when reporting the news, and does subjectivity tarnish a reporter's integrity, and is it even possible for a journalist to be objective?
Well, the answer to that is editors. And checks and balances. When you're in a news organization, you have lots of filters. Sure, everybody, journalists are not divorced from human life, they have multiple identities, some are religious, some grew up in small towns, some grew up in big cities, they've had experiences that affected them. I was in the first class of busing in Prince George's County, and so all of that is part of what makes up a journalist. You can't divorce that. I look at what we do as a craft. There's a way of going about it. Fairness is a value and a principle that's ingrained in what we do. And so if there's bias toward how you pursue it, what your interests are, but they're filters because multiple people read stories, they look at them, people bring in different perspectives, and I think that's how you get to the kind of journalism. We had a really a story that we've been writing a lot about the Secret Service and revealing a lot of the problems within the Secret Service. Some in government, including White House, not liked our stories. We think that there's been great accountability reporting, but in some of those stories that we have maybe 8 editors looking at them, and lawyers and everybody trying to think of every possible thing in the story and trying to see it from other people's perspectives. And so I think that's how you do it. You can never be, I think the term objective is a bad one, I think your main objective is to be fair.
I will tell a story on myself, which I'm actually, now that I'm launching into the story, I'm already regretting it. But so this was many years ago.
Can I tweet this?
Yeah, this is one important lesson of journalism. If you don't say off the record beforehand, you're screwed. So that's I will not say off the record. But many years ago, I had just first started blogging for Reason, and I stumbled upon this great, very sort of reason-y story. It was about the European Union. At the time, there had been a lot of coverage of the fact that there were these very intense regulations on trade, sort of cropping up in the EU, stuff like the precise curvature of bananas that were legal to be sold in the EU, that kind of thing. We're not huge fans of regulation at Reason Magazine, and so we've been covering this story. And I saw this post about how the EU was banning barbecue grills because of the carbon emissions. There was no way to produce a barbecue grill that met the EU carbon emission standards for small appliances. And I was like, oh, this is awesome. And I post it, and I put this funny picture of a guy in a chef's hat, and I was like, this is going to be huge. And then about 45 seconds after I hit post, I realized two things. One, the website that I had found this looked a little bit dodgy, and two, it was April 1st. And I was like, oh, God. And the reason that I jumped on it was my own biases, right? This story seemed like the kind of story that would be true, except for the part where it completely wasn't true.
But this gets, there's a good point here, because you found this on the internet, and then you ran with it. To me, this whole talk about objectivity is something that for years in journalism I really don't like. Nobody's objective. We all agree with that, and the search for objectivity is pointless. Being accurate is what everybody should strive for. If the National Review of Reason prints a story that's completely accurate, I don't care what their biases are. And one thing that, at Mother Jones, we have a lot of fact checking so that we don't make mistakes like that, because we all have in the past. And it's about getting out there and reporting things and making sure that you have it right. I'm doing a story that's coming out Monday about a top conservative strategist who ended up with $200,000 in his or her bank account because somebody swindled an elderly woman. And the story is came about because we were interested in the group that this person runs, but it's all from court records. It's all it's all completely documented. It's written in a very straightforward way. Very few adjectives in the piece, as the lawyer counseled, and but it's it's 100% accurate. We spent weeks making sure that every sentence in this is accurate, and so unfortunately, people who like this group will say, oh, it's from Mother Jones, and we'll dismiss it. Because that's the way we live now, and if they'd been in the Washington Post, they might be dismissed for being the liberal, mainstream media, which they're not, but people consider them that. But it's really the desire to sort of, be, even beyond being fair, is being accurate.
Well, I just want to add to both agree and have a slight disagreement with David on it. I mean, sure, that's your first standard. You have to have accurate, because if you don't have accuracy, then forget about it. I mean, but fairness is such an important part that goes hand in hand, because there are facts of omission too. You can be accurate and you can present all the facts that are in a piece, but what did you leave out? And if people come to a story and you have directed them to think about a subject in a certain way by aligning the facts, all accurate, but what don't they know? And that's where you get into fairness, and that's why that's an important principle.
Well, I'm saying it's not, Kevin.
Because if you don't have the stuff, and if and there's sometimes a tendency, and that's where bias comes in, to use Catherine's revelations, that you want people to think about it a certain way. And so sometimes you can see stories where they've downplayed facts that would undermine the argument and thrust of the story. And there you have something that's not fair.
I will just note that my upshot of this story, which has been excellently mansplained by other people at this panel, but my upshot of the story was actually going to be the case for vanity and the speediness of the internet as a corrective to bias, which is to say, the minute this piece went up, I was like, oh shit, so many people are going to tweet that this story was wrong. And so I posted a correction. I didn't take it down, because that's not what we do. When you make a mistake, you leave it all out there. I posted a correction. I tweeted about it. And it was both because my own self-image required me to sort of own up to my mistakes and be the good guy in my own story about how I'm the bad guy. And also precisely because I knew that there were going to be all these other people who disagreed with me looking to jump down my throat. I think the existence of sort of my ideological opponents right in the same arena that I was operating is, it's not the same mechanism as a fact checker and a lawyer, but it's a mechanism that works pretty well.
I totally agree with that. And to build on it, I think that's perhaps counterintuitively, in pursuit of fairness, I think that's one reason why it's worthwhile to be pretty open about our own biases to the extent we know them in public or online. I mouth up on Twitter constantly, like all day long, and it creates, I think, for some followers an impression that I'm really left-wing or really right-wing or really whatever, but often I'll get pushback that's informed, thoughtful pushback, we'll have a good discussion, and sometimes that helps me figure out something I haven't been thinking about, because, as you said earlier, we're not really good at perceiving our own biases necessarily. Or if it doesn't help me get more information, at least it kind of feels more fair to me to let the readers know this person has a certain perspective on this law or this person. So.
You should follow Erica on Twitter. She's kind of a rock star.
Also, can I add, speaking of April Fools, that we did our story this year about Matthew McConaughey. We said he was going to run for ag commissioner, and immediately some poor young journalist at the Washington Examiner maybe posted that as a real story, picked it up, and same kind of thing. It actually, sort of similarly plausible. I mean, he wouldn't be underqualified compared to the current candidates for ag commissioner. But I think your story's kind of a great story because it's so benign, right? It's like it was plausible, and you can kind of explain it, and it's a good moment to describe what happened, and builds your sort of credibility over the long term and integrity for correcting that and explaining it. But that journalist in question, I don't know who it was, but I'm sure she's a young journalist. I'm sure she's being kind of asked to post 5 times a day and just kind of keep things coming, keep the content mill fed. I doubt there's a fact checker involved. I doubt there's an editor even involved, and so there's no fail-safe mechanism to help that get out. So, and that's going to be, I think, increasingly the case.
Beyond these ethical concerns, there's also the concern about profitability. Can objective and more balanced journalism hope to bring in the same ratings and revenue that partisan news gets? Dick, you want to talk about that a little?
I'm not in the TV business. I've never been in the TV business. TV is ultimately a real mass business, and I think the evidence, just as an observer with no special knowledge, is that the answer may be no on television. I think in general, however, if you look at digital news, there are now a gazillion options. And there are lots of different ways to fund them. The funding of our business is enormously challenging at this point. And television really is the one exception to that, I think, left. But the newspaper business and the magazine business in this country is in very, very big trouble, and the things that are coming up as possible partial replacements to them are varied, and some of them I think will work and some of them won't. We can get deeper into that if you want.
I don't think anything I've ever written has ever made anyone any money.
No,
I mean, magazines in particular, Reason is a 501c3. When I worked at the Weekly Standard, we were a Rupert Murdoch tax deduction. So, but that actually, that works okay. I mean, I think there is certainly as a libertarian, I'm not about to talk smack about the profit motive, but there's also a place for people to do the things that we do and not worry about that. Yeah.
I don't think being partisan outside of maybe TV, particularly with Fox, it makes anyone more profitable in the media. Whether it's ideological places like Mother Jones, we're a nonprofit like ProPublica, but the National Review, the Nation magazine, Reason's a nonprofit. None of these make any money. The Texas Monthly makes money, but you're a general interest publication. And I don't know what the Post is doing these days, Kevin, but
we make money.
Okay. Not as much as you used to, though.
Is that really true? Is the Washington Post profitable?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, it wasn't before it got sold, and there's been an enormous investment. So I would be very surprised.
I'm not here representing the business side of operation. Representing the journalism side, but I believe that the first thing in any business, people have to want your product, right? Yeah. I mean, they have to want it. So there's a distinction. any particular piece of work you produced. It has the ability now to get a huge audience. And the way we measure that audience now is both in unique visitors, that's the nomenclature, which is basically readers, people who will come to you, and page views, which is what people will click on, what will they share. And so everybody's is in that game. Everybody here wants to have their story, their video, whatever they're doing, their blog posts, seen by millions of people and shared and passed around. And that is the method, at least, toward profitability and toward making money. Because, advertisers want customers, right? And you demonstrate that hey, we have millions and millions and hundreds of millions coming to us, then people pay attention. And so I would just say just to get to no one has figured out the business model of newspaper. We've seen in a lot of places in cities, the places that were basically the organs, the instruments of news in cities, particularly in newspapers, dying. Many of our friends out of jobs. We've seen layoffs. But that still doesn't change that, we have the ability now for people to come to our work in vast, greater numbers than ever before.
That is certainly true, but I do think it's important to say, Washington Post is a great newspaper. I think unquestionably one of the 3 great newspapers left in this country. And it is, in my judgment, at least a greater newspaper under your leadership and Marty's than it was a year ago.
Thank you for that.
On the other hand, somebody who used to be in the newspaper publishing business, at least where I sit, the things that you have done to make it better in the last year, which have attracted a larger audience, to be sure, I would be astonished if they had also made it more profitable, or actually, to put a finer point on it, less loss-making. And that's great if you're owned by one of the richest men in the world, for whom the losses are a rounding error, and you are. And so that's a good thing for America, because it needs more newspapers like the Washington Post, not fewer.
Yeah, I would just say stay tuned on that, on the profitability part.
But the bigger issue here too is with the increase of viewing on the internet, good information competes with bad information rather easily now. You used to have to own a printing press and barrels of ink, and only some people can invest in that in order to have newspapers and get your news out. Now anyone can post anything at any time about anything they like, and therefore the information that the Post puts up, or ProPublica, or Mother Jones, Reason, Texas Monthly, which cost a lot. Costs a lot. You got to hire people. You got to pay them benefits. You got to, all these things competes with information that is cheap to produce, and that's in a form where the advertising costs rates have fallen because people can advertise in a lot of other places now when they only used to be able to advertise in newspapers and magazines, and so that's why you see a rise in nonprofit journalism. You got 3 on the panel here that are nonprofits, and it leads me to think that in some way, are we looking at a future when, if you want, good, investigative enterprise journalism that may not be able to exist in the marketplace the way it exists now, people will be supporting it the same way they support NPR, PBS, ballets, symphonies. There's not a single museum in this country that can, except maybe the Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. But other than that, there's not a single museum that really survives as a free market entity. But yet these are all important cultural institutions, and some contribute a lot to public discourse. And it may be until the business model is found, if it ever is found, that in order to support journalism, you're going to have to support journalism. There's not a single, I doubt very much if there's anyone here under the age of 30 who pays for information, who buys a newspaper, subscribes, or even pays for cable. So, and I don't see that changing yet.
All right, can we go on to the next question? So today, only 13% of professional journalists identify as minorities. According to the Pew Research Center, the number of black journalists has actually decreased by 40% since 1997, while a Media Matters for America study found that only 38% of American journalists are women. How does this lack of diversity in the newsroom affect the journalism that we're consuming?
I'd just like to note that this makes our panel perfectly representative. Of the industry.
Not.
Well, this is 40%, not 38%.
Oh, okay, sorry.
The
Journalists aren't very good at.
One of us should talk less, I guess.
The 40% is representative. The racial minority stuff is not, and that is a big problem with lots of really troubling implications. And, we've been talking about this for a long time, and none of these thoughts are novel, but as Kevin said before, right, people are shaped, everyone is shaped by their own life experience. And unless you have in a newsroom or any place else, people with a very broad range of life experience, they are not going to well understand other people's life experience, and we are in the business of understanding other people's life experience and translating them. And to the extent that we are going backwards and not forwards on this as an industry, I think inevitably we are going to, and have been in many high-profile examples, do a less good job, particularly when the news seems to come from unexpected places, largely because we weren't looking there before.
I think that the figures you cite, too, are measures of things that are easy to measure, gender and ethnicity. More broadly, I think that journalism, especially national sort of top-tier or elite journalism, whatever we would call it, is characterized by a profound lack of experiential diversity relative to the population that it covers. With fewer journalists who have military backgrounds, who have certain religious backgrounds, who have geographic backgrounds, or who are located in different parts of the country, I think that just naturally means that the press corps is primed to be aware of a certain set of issues that aren't necessarily the mainstream ones or the most important ones or the only ones out there. To some extent, I think it will change over time, especially on the ethnicity front. We, like in Texas, for example, at our magazine, we're about half and half, men and women. We're good on that front. We're actually doing quite well, but we're really underrepresented with African American and Hispanic journalists. That could be in part because Texas' population skews towards older Anglos and younger Hispanics. So as time goes on, we'll have to have more Hispanics in the workforce in all industries. But I think it's largely because that's correlated with economic background, right? So I would say my number one way I would like to try to improve the diversity of the coming up journalists would be to start paying the interns, which is really rare.
We're in the business of covering the world, and so you have to have a representative newsroom in order to be able to do that effectively. It just makes logical sense. The percentages in our newsroom are much larger than those, and I think the thing that news organizations would have to do is make that a core value in order that to happen. If it's not a core value, then it's too easy not to. We were talking earlier about just the human nature being what it is. People hire their friends. They go for recommendations among the people they know. And so if you don't have a diverse newsroom or diverse university or a diverse pizza shop, you perpetuate that. And it's like particularly in newsrooms, you want to have people who disagree with each other, people who are odd, people who are not the same. As we were talking earlier, it's like if it's great to have a bunch of friends together, a newsroom full of friends, it's great for a party, but it's not really great for our business. So I think the problem that we've had in our industry with the kind of stats that you've made is that not enough places have made that really a core value. It's like a secondary value.
I will say there's one sort of strange second-order effect of this emphasis on diversity as providing this kind of experiential diversity, right? The bringing of different backgrounds to the newsroom. One thing that happens, which I would hope would fade as newsrooms become more genuinely diverse, is that if you're the person who represents your category, you're pushed pretty hard to speak and write about things in that category. Eric and I were talking about the fact that both of us made decisions pretty early in our careers to not write about lady stuff. There aren't a lot of lady libertarians. There are more now, actually, than when I started, but it was kind of a battle at the beginning of my career to not be given every single media appearance that had anything to do with anything that could even be remotely construed as a women's issue, because I'm not that interested in that stuff. I wanted to write about other things. So there is, one sort of second-order effect of non-diverse newsrooms is that when you are the diverse person, and when I'm bringing diversity to a newsroom, you can imagine how diverse it is, but that you wind up kind of shoveled into this box, which should be precisely not the point.
So we've talked a little bit about this before, but that foundations have become this new model for getting serious journalism funded because of shortfalls in advertising. Are there dangers in philanthropists, donors attaching strings to their dollars concerning which stories get reported?
Well, yeah, but at Mother Jones, we are, about half our revenue is from donations, but they can also be from our subscribers who donate. About a quarter of our 200,000 subscribers donate, as well as paying subscription fees. But we've set up firewalls. We've set up the business people go out there and they try to get money from some foundations and some individuals. And I know who some of them are, but usually I don't know. And it's always made abundantly clear that that they don't have any editorial say. Now, I assume in a lot of places, and Dick can talk about what happens in his shop, that there may be efforts made, suggestions made, and so on. But from what I see where I sit, it's really on the margins at most. And you have for-profit owned media that's also owned often by, say, a billionaire who may have an interest in something or another. And I'm not saying that in those instances they do anything, but it certainly wouldn't be hard to imagine someone like that making a suggestion to an editor, who would then be up to the editor to tell him to get lost or not. So I don't see there much difference, in terms of ownership here. Everything is owned by someone, and everyone has an agenda or interest or opinions. So I think in both sides of the equation here, whether you're owned by a tycoon or you get some money from an assortment, a diverse array of foundations, you can be influenced. But at Mother Jones, we make sure we have a diverse array of supporters, so we're not dependent on any one.
And have you ever gotten any pressure to print or not print?
No, I've never. We have gotten calls after the fact from people who didn't like something that was written, but all they said was they didn't like it. I don't remember any funding being pulled and no threats made before or after the fact. So I've been doing this for 7 years, and The Nation magazine was technically a for-profit entity, although it lost money all the time. It was made up by donors, including Paul Newman. And they would come in and sometimes say, well, have you thought about this or you've thought about that? And of course you listen to them, the same way that the owner would come in and say, there's a factory at the end of the town that I think is spewing something. Can you take a look? So I really don't see this as being a big issue.
Well, first of all, nonprofits are not actually owned by anybody. They are mission-driven organizations, no more than the university is owned by somebody. They're mission-driven organizations, and the responsibility of their management and of their board is to hew to that mission, and of the board to make sure that management is doing so and nothing more. I think these issues are actually serious, but in the sense that you've got to keep an eye on them, and at ProPublica, we've been serious about them from the first. The analogy to me that works in the nonprofit space, and that has guided us from the very beginning, is the analogy to advertisers in traditional media. There are things you will let advertisers do, and then there are a lot of things that you won't. You don't tell advertisers what you're going to publish before you publish it. We never tell donors what we're going to publish, or our board what we're going to publish before we publish it. There are relationships of them to the content that are okay, and then there are quite a few things that are not. And I've found that if you use, so I think it is a serious concern and something about which people have to be constantly vigilant, as we were, for instance, at the Journal, about our relationships with advertisers. But I think if you keep that metaphor in mind, it's pretty easy to steer the right course.
Well, I guess I kind of see where that is. I think the dangers of any model are really ineradicable. Everyone's going to have some dangers, and we're all just going to be vigilant. I'm not sure I would go for the advertising analogy, because advertising you see in the publication, it's embedded alongside the coverage. So as a reader, there's a layer of transparency that you can see if there's like a saddle company ad.
I mean, honestly, we are infinitely more transparent than any for-profit media company in the United States. We disclose the salaries of all of our top people. They don't. We disclose every single one of our donors down to $5,000. They don't. So, I mean, there's, and the government mandates a fair amount of that. So, I mean, there's a great deal more transparency in the governance of nonprofits than there is in the governance of for-profits.
I think that could be fair, but I'm thinking, and I wasn't meaning that about ProPublica in particular, but I think that we've had a bit of these debates about some nonprofits in Texas, just listing your donors or listing them on certain stories. Is that sufficient if people have to go check the site and kind of go to the next page and like sort through a list? And if you don't know the total donations, you only know the names of the donors. Is that really enough? I think in that case that I'm referring to is doing fine. They have the same sort of walls between editorial and donors that you'd see between advertisers and editorial at a magazine that like us. But I can see the direction of the concern.
Dick, could we just talk for a minute, because you're at the helm of sort of the new model for long-form investigative, time-intensive journalism that is sort of seen as a luxury at so many publications now, and so many publications are cutting those kinds of staffers and those kinds of projects. I was talking to somebody who's a journalist in New York who had worked for you, and I'm not sure I got this right, but is it accurate that your ProPublica spent like $750,000 in 18 months on one long investigative piece?
Yeah, I'm not sure that's anything to be proud of, but yes, we did. But yes, we did. And it was on the dangers of Tylenol, acetaminophen, the most common version of which is Tylenol, and I will give you all a very helpful hint. Never, ever take more than it says on the box to take.
$750,000 later.
Well,
I'm sure there was a lot more to it. Expensive advice.
But life is priceless.
well, here's the thing. People taking that advice would save 100 lives a year in this country. The fact that that advice wasn't followed for many years led to confusion between separate brands of infants and children's Tylenol in a way that was very dangerous. There are lots of issues surrounding Tylenol. I commend the series to you. It's called Overdose. I actually think it's a very important contribution to journalism. It's the most widely taken over-the-counter medication in the country, and it is very, very poorly understood. And I think there's no question that if it came to market again today, it would not be permitted to be marketed in the way that it is. It isn't in other countries. And ironically, for instance, the versions of it that are sold by prescription are much more strictly controlled than the versions that you're allowed to go down to your pharmacy and buy without any guidance. Laying all of that out, which is a very complicated business with a large and very powerful company pushing back all the time, is the kind of thing that takes a lot of time.
Do you think any organization other than yours, NBC News, the Washington Post, the New York Times, could have done an 18-month-long investigation of something like this?
I think there are a few other news organizations in this country that could have done it, and probably you're right, fewer than 5.
Can you just talk for a minute, Dick, about why it took 18 months and why it was so expensive, the project?
In that case, getting really reliable data was very challenging, and to reach valid conclusions really required reliable data, so that was a very big part of it. Finding people to talk, getting documents running to ground, some things that the company had known for a very long time but had made very significant efforts to keep secret. Took a lot of time to ferret out.
So why 750,000?
It's just when you throw a lot of people.
Okay. So you had
at
how
something.
many people working on that?
Well, we had 2 full-time reporters over that period, but we also had a very significant data effort as well, and then editors along the way.
All right. Has the shift in media from print to online outlets contributed to more polarized news or just more news? Or does it just level the political playing field?
Well, I'll jump in and say that, there's more news, but there's a lot more commentary and a lot more of just stuff that wouldn't fall in the category of news. I think actually the kind of reporting, and it doesn't have to be the kind that Dick's talking about, but even the kind of people who are actually trying to find out stuff that people don't know, that population is shrinking, actually. And what's proliferating is people commenting on the stuff that's out there. That might be everything from Renee Zellweger's new look. And if you were to Google that, millions of people are commenting on it, they're sharing it, they're talking about it, they're constructing their own analysis, and that's people want to be in the conversation and feel like they're in that flow, and that's the kind of stuff that's shared a lot. But I think the finding out stuff, whether it's about your local government here in Providence or mine or on a national level, there are a relatively small number of people doing that work.
And it costs a lot. This is what, I said earlier, what Dick just pointed out. It's hard. It takes time. You got to pay. The people who do this have to be skilled at it. It's not easy to do, to send someone out and just say, find out something that people don't already know. And I think in a lot of places, because it takes long to produce things, and sometimes it's in subject areas that aren't quite as sexy as Renee Zellweger's new look. It doesn't always get the payoff. Sometimes it does in terms of traffic or things that you can measure metrics-wise. And that's why there's been a lot of consolidation in media, and these are the kind of the jobs that get cut, these and overseas reporting bureaus and such. So, places like, Time Magazine and Newsweek, which still, do some great reporting, they do a lot less of it just because they have less bodies and because they're trying to work on the margins. And a lot of places online, BuzzFeed, Huffington Post are trying to do some good original reporting and beef up, but they also make a lot of money from aggregating, which is cheap, and from listicles about cats juggling monkeys or monkeys juggling cats. And boy, that was really pretty cool, that video. There's a lot of emphasis put on that. And it's interesting how some places, like BuzzFeed in particular, are trying to marry the two approaches. And I wish them luck, because I want if they support serious stuff by frivolous stuff, that's fine by me.
I don't think the listicles are necessarily frivolous. I think some of those are excellent slideshows of animals holding stuffed animals that look like them. I read those happily. Anytime I'll read them, I think they probably take a lot of work, more than a blog post about the campaign. But as I think, as you say, I would say one thing that I'm thinking about a lot as somebody at a traditional, legacy institution. It's 40 years old, so it's, legacy institution in Texas. We take that pretty seriously, but at the same time, it's sort of the splashier side, the more P.T. Barnum side of news. I mean, it's sort of, I guess, considered vulgar or kind of frivolous, or that it might cast a shadow on the whole enterprise, but we do a barbecue quadrennial issue. It probably takes about as much money as the Tylenol investigative report. I'm not sure it saves lives, but it's hours and hours of work. It's very serious metrics. It's a big project, tons of research, and it sells really well. It makes a ton of money. And then the next issue, we put Ted Cruz on the cover and have a long profile about him, and it sells terribly. But we kind of can keep the long stories coming out because we have the
barbecue.
The pop, yeah. So
I will say, actually, the this idea that there are fewer people doing reporting, like real reporting, I guess it really depends on how you count. I mean, Dick gave this example of Cronkite in Vietnam, but it's actually, I was struck by the fact that there is an identical story at the beginning of Walter Lippmann's Public Opinion about the sort of, the reporting coming out of World War I, and this idea that there's actually kind of a triangle of the truth, the public's perception of the truth, which in his case was often delayed by weeks and weeks because it was difficult to transfer information, and then what the public does with its perception of the truth, which may at that point have nothing to do with what's actually going on the ground at the moment. And I think what comes to mind when you read something like that is like the Arab Spring stuff. I mean, when you think of people tweeting from the middle of a crowd that's rioting somewhere. Maybe it's true there are fewer people who get paid to be full-time investigative journalists, but, this is, to whatever extent that is the fault of the internet, it is also to the credit of the internet that we can get information out of war zones, for instance.
So I have one more question before we open it up to the floor. What do you think the role of the modern news media is in creating civic community, equality, solidarity? Should journalism even try to create public agendas? Kevin?
Well, I think the role is to use the tools of our that are available to us in the digital era to engage the public. And I think, we try to do that. You have the ability to create discussions, to host them, to moderate them, to help to give people a chance to respond to your work, to respond back to them. And I do think that helps the dialogue, and that helps make society better.
David?
To me, the job of journalism, wherever you come from, is illuminating the world for others so that they are better informed and can participate to the degree to which they like, whether it's ardently, in a partisan political way, or just in terms of conversations they have. And, I think it's become increasingly difficult to have an impact that way because of the proliferation of media, news, whatever, and because one thing we haven't talked about is one little pet theory of mine is that media, call it reporting, public affairs media, whatever it is that we do here on this panel, used to compete only with itself. The Washington Post competed with the Washington Star. The Nation competed maybe with the New Republic. Texas Monthly competed with whatever general interest, maybe the local Dallas Monthly and the Texas newspapers, because people used to divide their lives up into, okay, I'm reading a newspaper now. I'm watching the news before I watch sitcoms. Mm-hmm. I'm reading The Atlantic or The New Yorker because I like to do that every once in a while. And that was their time they put aside to engage in this sort of information absorption. But nowadays, everything comes at us through the same pipe. So as you're on your screen, you're looking at maybe the ProPublica thing because someone tweeted about it, but then there's a chat message from someone at Facebook about a viral video that the Texas Monthly blogged about. You go there, and it's barbecue. Okay, but now I have to go onto Amazon to buy the thing that they're talking about. So now you're shopping, and while you're shopping, you're checking your email, and then it's back to Reason, or it's someone, or it's something, a video from your local news station. And so everything kind of bleeds together. All the information we absorb as citizens comes in kind of at the same level. It's shopping, it's entertainment, it's social media, it's gossip, it's important news. And I don't quite know exactly what impact that has, whether that sort of ends up diluting all the very important work that we do or not, but it certainly makes it hard to stand out. And I certainly think that we're now competing with the whole range of data and bytes that come at us in a way that's much different than when people used to sit down and read newspapers and read books. I don't mean to sound like an old fogey here. Maybe people who grow up with this process it differently. But I think, we're playing on a much lower or even plane, and that makes it more difficult.
Okay, so we'd like to hear from you now. If you have questions, we've got microphones up in the aisles here and are happy to take them, and you can address them to a particular person or just in general, and people will jump in.
Thank you very much for the conversation. I was intrigued by the difference between... There's a difference between fact and opinion, and particularly when it comes to science and settled truth. And we could talk about evolution or immunization, but global warming is one that is really confounding. And so while it would be interesting to understand the opinions around whether we need a carbon tax or we need to ban Catherine's gas grill, it's not clear why we're still arguing the facts of this really important factor, and the fact that we aren't, as a society and a media, leveling scientific literacy and continuing to give opportunities for those who actually are not arguing with facts, an opportunity to dissuade folks that don't really have a context to make important decisions about what's next in terms of our nation, our globe in the future.
Can I actually jump in on this? Because being from Texas, I'm aware of this phenomenon of global warming skepticism that you mentioned. I think we kind of as a country are not really debating the general fact that climate change is real, right? I mean, we see polls show a majority of Americans consistently saying they believe it. I guess we would debate facts about what will the effects be, what should the response be, what is the degree of change, or what does the overall pattern look like. But a majority feels that way. And so it's sort of the political layer that's having these hyper loud, very heated debates about that big fact in itself. A couple years ago when I was at The Economist, I did a couple of posts where we actually had pretty good commenters at The Economist blogs for some reason. Some 10% silly, but mostly pretty thoughtful. And I asked them, if you don't believe in anthropogenic climate change, why don't you believe in it? Or what's your kind of skepticism? And it was really interesting and worth doing because we had probably 100 responses, and a lot of them were pretty thoughtful. Or at least interesting. There were patterns. There were different groups of disbelief, right? There were people saying, I don't believe in it because I read those emails from East Anglia where they were talking about goosing the results, or I don't believe in it because, actually I kind of believe in it, but I think I'm so frustrated by hearing how stupid I am that and we're not going to change anything, and it would cost a lot of money to do a carbon tax, so I'm against that. One or two who were like, I don't believe in it because that would never happen to God's creation, but so it was a kind of a spectrum of disbelief that was a little more nuanced than I think it's portrayed sometimes. And to me that kind of pointed to where I find myself on this, that we don't really need to keep having the debate about whether or not it's real, unless we're trying to score political points about how stupid rednecks are, right? We can just say, natural gas is killing coal, emissions are going down partly for that reason, that's good for industry, it's good for clean air, good for clean water, solar is getting cost competitive, we can do that now, and kind of proceed as though the question is settled, without making it a kind of normative issue, how much you believe in anthropogenic climate change, perhaps.
But we do have like 15 out of the 17 Republicans on the House Science Committee who say they don't believe in it.
Yeah,
and if you poll, like, and I hate to point fingers, but you poll someplace like Fox News, and it's like 80%. I'm making this number up, so don't fact check me. But it's majority of their viewers don't believe that it's real. And I think the media has gotten better at this in the last few years. But for a long time, it was like, okay, some people believe this and some people believe that. We do both sides and let the public decide. And that sort of journalism is something that I really don't like because, I don't know how many of you saw the John Oliver bit that he did a few months on this, but he said to have a fair debate about this, you have to do this. And he brought out 98 scientists onto his set who believed, in this, and 2 who didn't. And he said, okay, now we're having a fair debate. So don't, which you can't do inside of a newspaper story or a 2-minute package on the nightly news. But for a long time, there's this idea of, and people call it the false moral equivalency, that you have to give each side a say. But in some issues, that really holds us back. I think we've moved away from that. But as politics have become more partisan, and I think a lot of it is, part of it is due to a backlash towards Obama's election, but that's another issue. People have dug in their heels on this issue on the conservative side, in part because Obama is in favor of it.
I think that's probably true, but I would say look back to 2006. I mean, George W. Bush believed in anthropogenic climate change, signed the Kyoto Protocol, and said that he thought that it was a serious issue, should be addressed, but that it would be really expensive to address it at that point, and so he wasn't sure how to, what the best approach would be, and so he didn't want to move on climate action, and that is kind of the median opinion among Americans, right? That's a pretty plausible view. So I think that we can have that debate. That's not a false moral equivalence debate. How should we best respond to this situation? I feel like we don't need to keep having the debate. If people on the right get reactionary about it, that's their problem, right?
But I do think the question was getting at something. I think we are still not nearly good enough, particularly at telling public officials to their face and telling their constituents straight on when they are not telling the truth. I think it would have been good if a reporter had said to the governor of New York yesterday at his news conference, Governor, what you have just said is irreconcilable with what you said yesterday. Have you learned something different? And do you know something all the rest of us don't? Right? Or when the governor said that the doctor in New York had broken quarantine, I think it would be good if at that point someone at the live news conference stood up and didn't ask a question, but just said, Governor, that is not true. And we don't do that, and we should, and we let them use us as theater to, let's not put too fine a point on it, tell lies, right? When the morons on the House Science Committee hold a hearing and tell lies, someone who puts it on the evening news is abetting them, right? If they wanted to hold a hearing and announce that the Earth is flat, and I was the producer of the CBS Evening News, I would not put that on the air unless I introduced it by saying, in case you were not paying attention in the 3rd grade, the Earth is round. Today, remarkably, and this is the news, some people in the House of Representatives tried to suggest that it was flat. And by the way, again, they're wrong.
But then what happens is
we're just not good enough at that, and frankly, both parties do it. There is no monopoly on this. There may be on any given issue, but across the board, there is not, and we are just not comfortable enough on this. I think the New York Times lead, for instance, on this today, was Cuomo gets into a spat with de Blasio. No. Cuomo gets into a spat with Cuomo, right?
I'm not sure who you mean by we here. We're not, if somebody got up in the House of Representatives and said the Earth is flat, that headline that you just described would be all over the internet. Maybe the New York Times wouldn't do it. I don't know, but it doesn't matter.
It's not much different to say that climate change is not caused by the intervention of human beings.
But that coverage appears all over the place. I mean, anytime someone says climate change is not man-made, there's a huge cottage industry to.
See, this is what we're talking about, Dick. What we're talking about here too is the connection or lack thereof between media and politics, because while indeed the New York Times and the Washington Post have done, great stories on the existence of climate change and they cover it, what happens is you have a debate in which every Republican president is asked to raise their hand if they believe in climate change and they, is caused by human causes, and they don't go up. And so that may be reported, by Dan Balls in the Washington Post, but on Fox News it's kind of cheered. Look at these people; they're not giving in to the liberal conspiracy theory.
I just think
so they end up not getting the full punishment that you would like them to receive. And I'm not saying this is a good thing. I think this is a bad thing. They're being actually reinforced by other forces of media.
I just think we're not taking our own responsibility sufficiently. I thought that the basic moment at which the 2012 campaign ended, in the long run, it ended with your story. Yeah. But in the technical run, where it ended was when Romney said something about Benghazi in the debate, and Ann Compton had the courage. She had been there, and she said, "Actually, Governor, that's not true." Yeah. Right? And it was over. You could sort of feel the air go out of the balloon. I think that took from journalistic norms, I think that took enormous courage on her part. I think it was a great thing to do, and I think we ought to do it 100 times a week until they stop lying.
I'm all for that.
Hi, I just wanted to say thanks so much for coming here and speaking to us. It's been a really enlightening conversation, and I'm really glad that I was here to listen to it. I wanted to talk a little bit about technology. A lot of your discussion has revolved around it as a platform for other people's voices, but I wanted to ask about your experiences with it as a source for stories in and of itself, especially in light of some of the threads of the conversation revolving around where we look for stories and how that's influenced by our perspectives, especially with the Tylenol story at ProPublica, and a lot of the data reporting that's been going on there, Dollars for Dogs, for example, Charlie Ornstein's amazing healthcare reporting. I wanted to ask, especially also to Mr. Korn, given the skewed nature of his 47% story and the leak of that video, what your experiences have been in terms of using technology and computer-assisted reporting as sources for your stories instead of just implementing technology as a platform for how those stories are accessed, and what that means in terms of how to assess fairness in how we do our reporting, and what that means for the partisan nature of the media that we've been discussing.
I'll just take a very quick step at it. One of the things is, for all the challenges of journalism, the best journalism today, I think, is better than it's ever been before. And one of the reasons that the best is better than it's ever been before is there are things you can do with all sorts of digital tools in terms of presentation, in terms of data collection, in lots of ways that you could never do before. And I think there are new kinds of stories and new kinds of storytelling. And a lot of them are the kinds of things that you're talking about. It's a huge advantage. We can go through data sets that were simply unmanageable before. We can derive national truths about them. We can then allow people to sort them for themselves right down to the level of their own doctor, or facilitate other news organizations doing it at a local level. I think we have only begun to scratch the surface of what some people call big data is going to make possible in terms of new kinds of news and new kinds of ways to tell stories about it.
We get a huge amount of play out of videos that random people have taken. In particular, we cover police misconduct pretty aggressively, and time was those stories were always he said, she says, right? They were always, the cop says, I thought he was going to point a gun at me. The guy says, I didn't even have a gun. And then the guy goes to jail, because that was how those stories always ended. And, that's just not the case anymore. And a big thing for Reason has been just trolling for and finding the best instances of this now huge genre of people filming their own confrontations with the police or filming other people's confrontations with the police. And actually, in DC just last month, they piloted a program for the cops to wear their own cameras. And in the press conference about it, the police commissioner said, "Yeah, well, I guess we're pretty much the last people to get our own cameras on the cops, aren't we?" And I think that's a perfect example of something where the technology is making the stories. It's taking stories that we were previously writing, that had to be researched, that had to be reported, that often maybe there really wasn't any way to find out the real story, and now there's video. And you can still lie with video, as any Michael Bay movie will tell you, but the idea that, when you get pulled over for a traffic stop, you can whip out your phone, and that in most, though not all states, the cop can't tell you to put it away, that's huge for us.
Yeah, I agree with what Dick said too, because at Mother Jones, we do a lot of data-driven stories and looking at databases and such, and often we try to make sure we portray them in a non-dry fashion. Often they lead to good interactives, maps, charts, and the like, and the fact that you have access to all these pools of data is just remarkable. It still takes a fair amount of imagination and creativity to figure out how to convey data to people in either a narrative fashion or some other fashion, so they will absorb the lessons that the numbers tell. And when it comes to the 47% video, show that anything now can be recorded. In fact, after the story made a big splash and I was able to reflect upon it, I marveled at the fact that it hadn't happened already, that some other major candidate hadn't been caught. And there was a close thing with Obama speaking at a fundraiser, but that was to a group of 300 people, and the feed went in the wrong direction. But still, everybody walks around with a recording device in their pocket now. And immediately, I think every political consultant in the world sat down their candidate and their clients and said, never ever forget this. And so in some ways it might have had a negative influence in making people less candid even when they speak privately. But also in terms of, Catherine mentioned war zones and so on, we've done a few stories about the siege of Kobani on the Syrian border in Turkey, based on some tweets and videos and photographs that were sent to us by a local resident, which we were able to sort of make contact with. And that's just, remarkable. I remember a couple of years ago, Amnesty International and Peter Gabriel started this project when they wanted to get, video cameras throughout the world to people to record human rights abuses, and they raised money, and it was a pretty good program. But, it's been supplanted by just the pace of technological advance. So we're always looking for that. We've gotten stuff from inside the Koch brothers meetings. We got Dick Cheney joking at a meeting about bombing Iraq. I've done a whole series of pieces on what Rand Paul said before he was a senator. That is all on YouTube. I mean, it's a little cottage industry. BuzzFeed's very good at this, of finding video footage. I think that's all wonderful. There are some privacy issues in all this, and we can discuss that at another point. But my bottom line is, if someone wants to be president, or they were vice president, or people who are leading us, they have less rights to privacy particularly when they're saying things in private that don't match what they're telling us in public.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for a great panel. I'm a proud Brown student parent, but I'm also the editor of the Tampa Bay Times, the largest newspaper in Florida, which also runs PolitiFact.com.
Yeah.
And appreciate everything you said, and I do think it's back to the future. We got to be out there calling politicians, and now we've started Pundit Fact. So we may be fact-checking.
Yeah, we don't like that as much.
Right here, check pundits as well. The one good thing I want to report is our print and online audience loves it. As consumer journalism, it's where our partners here in Providence do a great job. And so this fact-checking movement is a real excellent component added on. Just want to make that plug, but here's my real question, which maybe dovetails. We're all doing more accountability journalism, data journalism. The tools are better than ever. That said, I'm kind of curious, in the week that Ben Bradley passed along, how do you think Watergate would have gone down if it happened today? And given the ability for both sides to marshal their resources and mobilize, both sides as in partisan politics, would Richard Nixon have survived today if Watergate had happened now instead of when it did? Thanks.
Well, Roger Ailes, who runs Fox News now, was a Richard Nixon consultant, so I would put money on Roger to be able to do a lot of damage control back in those days. I mean, it's hard to play these history games if you look at like the Clinton impeachment scandal, which was sort of at the beginning of the rise of the age of internet media. There was a lot more marshaling on both sides, and Clinton was able to survive, and out politically through largely a different set of circumstances, of course. But I knew Ben a little bit. I'm sure Kevin knew Ben a lot more. But I still, like the idea of just the old school style of, because we haven't talked that much about this, of just shoe leather. Of just, I have a lot of young people who work for me, and I have to remind them that, information doesn't stop at Google, and the best way to actually really find out stuff that other people don't know is to talk to people, get out there. And, that was sort of the lesson of Watergate, and just the way they plowed through the possible sources. I mean, still, the movie is just a great tutorial on how to do this sort of stuff. But I don't know. I mean, Richard Nixon had a lot of skill back then, a lot of political skill at the time, and he still couldn't pull it out.
Well, I would say that, first of all, good seeing you, Neil. Know Neil and all the work that you guys did in PolitiFact. I'd just echo that. A great job in leading the way. And there is a great cottage industry that's developed on fact-checking. Bob, and that question has been bandied about. Bob and Carl tackled it on an essay that we published. We had the 40th anniversary of Watergate, had a big celebration down at the Watergate and panel and some of the old figures, and that question came up and everybody's debating it. I mean, we have the world of the social media now. People, they might have seen people coming out of the parking garage. There might have been more likely TMZ might have been there, gotten some footage. I mean, a lot of things could have happened, it just been, it was, and there would be more people racing to the story. One of the things that Bob talked a long time, and Ben did too, is just at times how alone they felt, and as the reporting went on over time, there weren't as many people, coming to it, and that was that feeling that, we're out here by ourselves. I don't think that would have happened in this era. But there are a lot of other tools available. I mean, when you start getting into some of the things that Trip Nixon Up campaign, a lot of the campaign data, and I think there have been lots of other ways to track people, easier to track down people to find out where they are now with online tools to get to them. But there is something about knocking on people's doors, and Bob has said that often, and it's advice I took as a reporter, that sometimes you can't get people, you just have to go and catch them at a time when it's just you and them looking at them, and they may be in their bathrobe and they have to confront you, and that's both a skill, and it's also, everybody's not comfortable in coming up to people and asking them questions, going to their home, standing out in front of, waiting for them. That is something that I think is still was a great part of the Watergate reporting.
I think that the Washington Post Watergate coverage was brilliant and deeply courageous and an enormous public service to this country. And it would have, for all the reasons and ways I think in which Kevin says happened, today as well. I do worry, not so much about the press's side of this as the political side. Nixon did not destroy the tapes, and ultimately he delivered them in response to a court order. I think anyone who can sit here and say that they are 100% confident that a president in that position in today's political environment who would choose not to destroy the tapes and then would choose to commit suicide politically by producing them in response to a court order, if anybody's completely sure that that's right, I think they're not paying attention. And actually, the best example, and I know this may make a bunch of people on the left in the room unhappy of this, to me, is the Clinton story, in which an administration on the left managed to persuade a majority of the American people that it was perfectly acceptable for the President of the United States to commit perjury in a federal court. That happened, and we all decided to reframe the issue as being about sex. You're entitled to your own frame, but the truth is that the next president who commits perjury in a federal court will not be the first. He will be, at best, the second, and that is not a happy statement about our politics.
Hi, I agree with David Korn's assessment of the one big pipeline that most of our news is now coming through. And I'm wondering what the panel thinks is the best way to approach this. So do you act like CNN and just talk about a missing airplane for weeks in order to drive up your ratings? Or do you try to separate yourself from this pipeline so that you can remain a legitimate news source? So what do you think is the best option?
You know, I think David is right, certainly, about the one big pipeline problem, but it's also, it's not entirely new, of course. I mean, newspapers are one big pipeline with lots of junk in them, too. I mean, they always have been, right? The comics page is clearly not performing the same vital civic role as A1, and, you know, I am not always going to read everything on A1 before I go read Miss Manners. I mean, that's a fact of any form of media. I think, you know, it is not always to the detriment of news that this single pipeline exists. I mean, if you go read a book review and then buy the book because you can, because the link is right there, I think that's a win, not a loss, for a better informed public, for, you know, sort of educated citizenry, however, whatever you want to frame the goal as. And so I think, you know, when we you know, I don't pay for very much media, but the media I do pay for is Netflix. I use it sometimes to watch documentaries. I mean, you know, I think there's this sort of idea that the junk is distracting people from the good stuff, and I think just as often the good stuff drives people to more good stuff in places that also hawk junk.
I mean, I think people have the ability to get what they want. I mean, that's the gift of the internet. I mean, it's not, you know, sure, there's compartmentalization, but most people are getting their information of any kind on this device. That's where the fastest growth is. It's probably 50% of people coming to us are coming through here, and most of it, they're coming through search and social. Either they're seeing it on one of their feeds at places they go to, it's getting shared. And so whatever you're interested in, you can go find, and you can get it in the way you want to get it.
You know,
that's the world we live in now.
Sorry, Kev. In thinking about this, I'm often reminded of one of my favorite New Yorker cartoons, in which you have a picture of Charles Dickens at a desk in front of a copy editor, and the editor says, "Now surely, Mr. Dickens, it could not have been both the best of times and the worst of times." And I mean, and I do feel that's kind of where we are here. You know, we have access to all this tremendous amount of information, but as you know, as sentient beings, we only have the capacity to absorb so much. And you can talk to people who study this, who they come up with these metrics, such as, it used to be that you would absorb maybe 1,500 messages a day or inputs a day, which could be anywhere from a billboard to a headline to a story, and every year it's doubling. And we're just really being bombarded. And we're being bombarded with a lot of good stuff. I watched Blackfish on Netflix when I was waiting for my daughter when she was late coming out of school. And that was wonderful that I could do that in my car on this little device. So you can bombard it with good information, you bombard it with a lot of bad information, and just anyone who has to keep up with their email, knows what I mean. So our information, processing, abilities, I think, are struggling to keep up with the amount of information we're being asked to process. And I don't have any real, solutions here, or even any real advice, other than every once in a while it's good to throw everything away and just read a book. That works for me. But I do think, it's a struggle that we're going to have to, we all have to live with individually. And I think it's a struggle that we in the media are going to have to keep thinking about in terms of how we present wheat instead of chaff.
Okay, so I was actually one of those unpaid interns at Texas Monthly this summer. So I'm going to shoot off a question to Erica. I was having a conversation with my dad, who's right back there, last 2 nights ago at dinner. And he is a Texas Monthly reader and a business owner in Texas.
Cool.
And I said, Erica's coming, I'm so excited. I really want to ask her this question about how Texas Monthly is so bipartisan, and he was like, well, I would characterize it as more left-leaning, I think, were his words. So, in light of that, from what I understand, from what I learned there, is that the readership of Texas Monthly is largely white, affluent business owners in Texas and other professionals, which I think is sort of code for primarily conservative. So I wanted to know, how do you conduct your political coverage so as not to compromise your own views and the views of the editorial board at the magazine, while also not alienating the large conservative contingent of your readership?
Sure, it's great. Thanks for being here. Thanks for you for being here for Texas. I don't really worry about what the readers are going to think. I think that's a bad path. I worry about it being fair and accurate to them. And if they email me or get in touch or write me a letter, which they do occasionally, then I'll try to respond and explain more if they have a question. But you can't cater to the audience, especially because the audience is not just the print subscribers to the magazine are older, affluent, more Anglo compared to the state as a whole. The digital readers, less so. It's a more younger, more diverse set. But any person who has an internet connection can read anything in Texas Monthly, eventually, if they want to. So we kind of just have to report it without, I think, a view towards what the audience will like or dislike. We do get emails from readers generally calling us left-leaning. I always write back to that and say, did you read my Ted Cruz story, or Brian's Greg Abbott story, or the Rick Perry cover package we did, or any of these many things we've done about the state we cover. But then we also get, left-leaning readers who write into that kind of story and say, you guys are in the tank for Republicans and you're supporting this regime and blah, blah, blah. So I think if we have a more or less balanced set of angry email, that's when we feel like we're doing well. I think part of our ability to kind of have balance in political coverage is, realistically, that for a mainstream media journalist, I probably skew pretty right on some issues, and I'm one of the key political writers there. That gives us some more latitude because some of the other writers lean left. It means if we hire somebody else for next session, we'll probably hire somebody who is left-leaning if they're known to have a lean at all. I think it works out pretty well. I think keeping in mind at the Monthly or at the Economist or anywhere else I would write for, just the need to be correct in the facts, to be fair in reporting the facts and not omitting key facts or key context elements. Having genuinely sort of idiosyncratic opinions, as most people do if they're following things closely and thinking about them from a non-partisan perspective, right? Having a sort of nuanced view of the context and of the people in question that we cover. I think journalism like that, even if it isn't a sort of, from a person with a political point of view or from a publication with a political point of view will be generally pretty solid and plausible. So that's the hope, at least, and we'll see how it goes. Thanks.
One more question?
Thank you very much for today's talk. My question is about the role of international media. So I think so far U.S. is one of the kind of dominant source of credible information, reliable information in the world. And I really like how the American journalists work. But the question is, right now we can access to any different media in different countries. We can always look at Al Jazeera's English web pages or BBC or, even CCTV or Straits Times, these different media in different countries. And I was wondering, how does the fact that people have now access to all these different kind of media in different countries affect your media coverage and also the framing of the issue, if there's any?
I mean, for our part, we actually focus largely on domestic issues, but one figure that we keep an eye on in our analytics is how many people are coming to our site from overseas. And, whenever those figures come out, I'm always surprised by how big they are. I mean, we are virtually never writing about anything that, in theory, would be of interest to anyone who wasn't closely following American politics. And it turns out people are closely following American politics all over the world, which is not exactly breaking news, but I do think being aware of that fact makes you write in a less provincial way. I am now careful not to say we when I mean America. This is something that libertarians are probably always a little bit better at because we're kind of wary of collective nouns. But I am now much more aware of the fact that when people are reading my writing, America might not be we to them, and I think that's to the good. It just makes you kind of put another layer on your imagined reader. It's not just the little old lady in Iowa; it's also the little old lady in Malaysia. So,
but what's great about this is that a lot of American outlets have cut back on having reporters overseas because it's very expensive and it's the type of news that often doesn't get the same amount of traffic that other things do when it comes to advertising. And so even though there have been more crises overseas and our fate seems even more intertwined each year with what happens overseas, to find these sources, Al Jazeera did great reporting on Egypt and in other parts of the Arab Spring. They had people where Americans often didn't get to, and whatever their biases might be, when they're reporting stuff live, that's really quite important. And on stories like Ebola, Iraq, and ISIS, I mean, we at Mother Jones seek to cover these things. We can't afford to send people overseas, but we look for people through Twitter or journalists who are covering this, and it's a difficult thing to try to assess their accuracy and their level of reporting competence before you quote them or use their video feed or cite them in any way. There are mechanisms by which you can try to do that, but I think it is a way to make up for deficiency that has occurred in American reporting overall. And BBC and others are very good sources often.
Does anybody else want to weigh in on this? Okay, we're under strict orders to end this at 1. So I'm sorry if others have questions that we didn't get to. Some of our panelists may be here for a few minutes, so feel free to mingle if you'd like. And I'd like to also thank you all for coming to what I think was a wonderful panel and asking some great questions. So have a great rest of your weekend.